Hello and welcome on this fine April 17th, 2020 to the University of California, Santa Barbara campus. It's probably been a couple months, maybe a month or two since you've been here. It's pretty nice to be here actually, and so the purpose of this field trip is to walk around a good portion of campus and show us some plants that some native, some non-native, but UCSB is a really special place for plants in general. Santa Barbara is a special place for growing plants, and that's because our temperature here and our climate is pretty much ideal for a huge range of plants. So we can take plants that are from California, we can take plants that are from other Mediterranean climates, we can take plants that are even from some tropical, subtropical climates and grow them here in Santa Barbara because it never really freezes and temperature doesn't really change all that much. Those of you who are from outside of California, believe me, and those of you who are from California, maybe not so much. But anyway, here we are. We're starting out, some of you probably recognize this parking lot as one that goes down to the marine science labs down on the south end. And we're standing here at the stairway that would take us down toward Campus Point. And this is a really nice spot to learn our first plant of the day, which is a California native plant. It's a California endemic plant. In fact, it's the rarest pine in California. And its native range has been restricted down to just one state park in San Diego County, just right next to UC San Diego's campus in La Jolla, and that's Torrey Pine State Park, State Nature Reserve, whatever it may be, named after the Torrey pine, Pinus torreyana, which is this tree right here. So the Torrey pine is now native only to Torrey Pine Nature Reserve and some little zones around there, as well as some populations on Santa Rosa Island, which is a channel island that is just north of Santa Cruz Island. Santa Cruz Island is a huge one that you can pretty much always see every day, and on clear days you can see Santa Rosa Island, and there happens to be Torrey pines out there as well. So check out that range map in your textbook in California plants, and you'll see just how restricted this tree has been. And that's not only because of natural reasons. Obviously, if you're from San Diego and you're a native anything there, be it natural, your range has probably been replaced by concrete. And that's what's happened in San Diego. So we're back in the Pinaceae. And when we're trying to distinguish a pine, as we've probably learned by now, one of the first characters we look at are the needles. And so these needles here are modified leaves, and leaves that are in bundles or fascicles. So the first thing we do when we're trying to figure out what kind of pine species we're looking at is we look at one of these fascicles and look at how many needles are in each one. And remember, when we're looking at these fascicles here, they're really just one continuous needle that would make up a full cylinder, but this has been divided up into what can be considered 5 different leaves or leaflets. Doesn't totally matter how you want to think of it. But they are all coming off of this one short shoot here. So in pines we have these long shoots, and then we've got short shoots. So just a long piece of stem tissue, and then a real short piece of stem tissue with 5 leaves coming out from it, and there would have been a bud where this fascicle came off of. So counting this fascicle, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. When I first walked up to this tree, I was like, wait a minute, I know this is for sure a Torrey pine, but here's a bundle with 3 needles in it. Here's one with 4 needles in it. What the heck's going on? But that's something that you'll encounter a lot with pines. And so when you're trying to identify a pine and make sure that you're identifying it properly, you want to look at a bunch of different fascicles to make sure that, like, okay, this is actually a 5 needle pine. Sometimes I'm going to find some fascicles with 3, sometimes with 4, maybe even sometimes with 2, but in general it's a 5 needle pine. So now we know the number of needles, and we can start to look at the characters of these needles, and just like the foothill pine, they kind of have a grayish hue to them, and that's because of some wax on the leaves that they make here, as well as some actual stomata that you can see. And Compared to a lot of pines, these needles, just like the foothill pine, are really burly and strong. They're also pretty long in length. So those are some really good characters to be able to identify the foothill pine, or I'm sorry, the Torrey pine. Also, like the foothill pine though, Torrey pines tend to have a real branching structure. So rather than having one real strong leader, like you would see in the pines right behind Devon there, and those Canary Island pines, where they have a strong leader and have a real nice conical shape. These ones are more branching and have more of a crown-shaped canopy. So of course, the other thing that we're going to look at when we're identifying pines is any reproductive structures that they might have. So we're lucky enough to find this modified branch here. Modified branch that's meant for doing sexual reproduction, and this is the female version of that. All the male cones have since fallen off, and I think that they're around mid-winter. I don't know, I'll put some text to modify that once I figure that out and fact check that with Natalie. But anyway, these are the female cones, and the female cones, just like pretty much all pines, are going to develop for 2 years. So it's 2 years after they initially get fertilized that they'll finally be ready to go. And I just found this developing female cone here. So here's one that's already opened up, and you can see, just like with our all the other pines that we've seen, there would be 2 seeds per scale here, per modified branch. And now here's a cone that's still developing. And so all of those scales are pretty much glued together by resin. You can see that resin kind of coming out there, and I'm getting it all over my hands. But this, the seeds within this cone have been fertilized. That's why they're seeds, and they're in the process of developing for maybe another 6 months or a year. You can see that on the scale, there's also a nice sharp little umbo here. That's about all I have to say about the Torrey pine. Pinus torreyana. There you go. So we are about to introduce a brand new plant family to you, as well as a new genus. This is one of your plant families that you'll be responsible for. It's a plant family that you've all heard of, at least the colloquial name for, and that's the palm family, which is the Ericaceae. So we've talked about an Ericaceae before. We're going to talk about an Araceae as well. This one is spelled A-R-E-K-C-E, as opposed to the E-R-I-K-C-E, the family that blueberries are in and all that. So all palms are in the Ericaceae. They're all monocots. So being that they're all monocots, do they make wood? Hopefully you're all saying to yourselves, no, right now, because wood is secondary xylem. It's made from the vascular cambium. Wood is a product of secondary growth, which we know monocots don't do, so monocots can't then make wood. So what I'm touching right here is not wood, but rather a bunch of fibers. And so if these things don't do secondary growth, then that means that they never really get wider. So that means that this tree was just as wide when it was this tall as it is now that it's 15 feet tall. And that's true especially for these ones down here that are starting to push 100 feet. So palms are monocots. They don't do any secondary growth. And if you look at their leaves closely, then you'll see that their veins are oriented parallel to one another. They also make fibrous root systems, which very often the root systems of palms will start to come up above ground, and they can even take in moisture from above ground. And the reason that palms have that adaptation is because most palms are from tropical or subtropical environments. So if you're from outside California especially, you probably totally associate California with palms. I know that's true for most of my friends that are not from California. When they think California, they think palms. And Devin, who's from the East Coast, is nodding his head right now. If you're from California, maybe even you associate California with palms, which is sort of funny because, yeah, palms are everywhere in California, but almost none of them are native to California. We only have one palm that's native to California, and it is only native to a small little pocket down in the southern desert bordering Mexico. The rest of them have been planted here and are introduced mostly from the subtropics. They do fine here, but they're not actually California trees. However, they're one of the most important horticultural trees in California, and they line all the streets. This street right here, which is Lagoon Road on campus, is lined with a bunch of Washingtonia all the way up and down. If you're from Pasadena, then is it California? It's not California. Colorado. Colorado Avenue has those 150-foot tall palms, and that's true for a lot of different places in California. And those are Mexican fan palms, and that's what I'm standing in front of right now. Mexican fan palms, which are in the genus Washingtonia, and that's a genus we're holding you responsible for. You don't need to know Washingtonia robusta, which is this species here. That's native to the northern Sonoran Desert of Mexico, as well as in Baja California. Not native to California, but one of the most common trees in California. The other species of Washingtonia, there's only two in that genus, that is actually native to California. That's that one that's native to those little desert oases down in the southern almost border of California, Arizona, Mexico, is Washingtonia foliifera. That's the California fan palm, and looks real similar to Washingtonia robusta. They both make similar types of leaves. So plants in the Ericaceae, or palms, make these pretty massive leaves. And there's basically two different kinds of leaves for palms. They can either be fan-shaped, so we call those fan palms, or they can be more feather-shaped. And there's a species right across the street that has that feather type of leaf, which we're going to actually learn that species here in a bit. So those are the two main types of leaves or fronds that you'll see for plants in the Ericaceae. So both Washingtonia foliifera and robusta are fan palms. They both have spines along the petiole. So what a lot of people would probably call a branch that's connecting the leaf to the trunk there, we all know is not a branch, but rather just a leaf stalk, just a super burly leaf stalk that is lined with some pretty hard spines. So hopefully we get an opportunity to see some palm flowers, but palms can be monoecious, they can be synoecious, where the flowers have both male and female parts. And this particular genus are synoecious, so they make both male and female parts, so anthers and carpels on the same flower, same structure. Cool. So we taught you the genus Washingtonia, and we talked about Washingtonia robusta, the Mexican fan palm. Talked about the fact that it reproduces on its own. It's naturalized here, and so you'll see little small Washingtonias all over town, especially if there's a vacant lot somewhere. And in fact, Matt Ritter, the author of your textbook, and I, when I was TAing for him for an intro botany class, we used to go around, get a Sawzall, cut down a tree just like this, and bring it into the lecture hall and dissect it and get all the way down to leaf by leaf, down to that meristem where we could pull out that heart of the palm and have everyone take a little bite of it. So just wanted to show you an example of naturalization of the Mexican fan palm. There's a little one here, there's a little one over here. If you have grown up with these somewhere near your house, which odds are if you have grown up in California, then you have grown up with them near your house, then you'll see them all the time pop up in the yard. Just starting with a couple little fronds near the ground. By the time they get to this size, you don't want to dig them out. That thing is in there good. So here's a naturalization of a weedy non-native palm. All right, so I'm now standing in front of that other species of palm that we just pointed to from across the street, and this is called a king palm, which is in the genus Archontophoenix. Archontophoenix cunninghamiana is the scientific name of this palm, and it comes from East Australia, but it's cultivated all over the world, especially in temperate or subtropical climates. It's one of my favorites. I think it's just super elegant, where the bark is nice and smooth. You can see the old leaf scars. So this is where the old leaf bases would have attached to the tree, and they're not super prominent on this. But then the leaf bases, when you're actually looking up into the tree, you can see an old leaf base on that one where it's been pruned, but those leaf bases are super bulbous and wrap around the top of the trunk there. You can see it maybe a little more clearly on those other ones. So this tree is making leaves that are alternately arranged with real short inner nodes. And then when it's time to flower, as you can see here from this old, what is now an old infructescence, an inflorescence will come straight out of a node from the axil of a leaf base, just like what would happen with any other plant. Got my mad hops there to find us some fruits. So these are fruits from this palm. Fruits which the fruit type is a drupe. So remember, drupes are the fruits that have a pit on the inside, so like an almond or nectarine or anything like that, or a coconut is another fruit that we've told you makes a drupe. So there's going to be some fleshy tissue around the outside, and then, well, not the case for this one, but there would be a real hard endocarp in there. Oh yeah, it just hasn't hardened yet. And then a bunch of seeds in the middle. So this is a fruit type for a palm, and palms make these inflorescences, and being that there's 2,600 or so species of palms, there's all different kinds of fruits that come off of palms. It's probably a good time to mention that the palm family is actually one of the most economically important plant families in the world. So there are some wildly important ones, like the palms that are grown for hearts of palm, maybe a little lower on the list. The coconut palm is a massively important plant, not just for pina coladas, but for oil and nutrients. People eat it, people drink it, and mostly in the third world and more tropical parts of the world. And also for palm oil, which is a majorly important crop as well. So palms make drupes. This is kind of a smaller version of one, whereas obviously a coconut is pretty big. And so all kinds of different adaptations to different environments. This is one, Archantophoenix cunninghamiana. So here we are just across the street from those king palms that we just looked at. And we're sitting here right in front of the MSI building area. This is like a coastal something, marine kind of building. I don't know what it is actually. But our next plant is here. But Devin also just spotted, here's another little mini Washingtonia. Remember, we just introduced this plant to you and told you that it naturalizes and it will reproduce on its own and pop up all over the place where it doesn't belong. Well, here's an example of that, where it's just a little youngster, but this thing would require quite a bit of work and force to get out of the ground. Okay, that aside, this is the next plant that we're going to learn, and it's in the Onagraceae family, which is a family that is near and dear to the Mazer lab for sure. But this plant here is a California fuchsia. Epilobium canum is the scientific name. Epilobium canum. So we're lucky enough to get some flowers back here on this individual. And so you're seeing that the flower parts are in fours, which is indicative of the Onagraceae. So we've got 4 red showy sepals, moving into 4 red and you might even say fuchsia colored petals. And the petals, each one, let's see if I can do a halfway decent job of dissecting this, but each of these petals has a nice lobe on it there, so kind of divided down the middle. Really beautiful white cream colored pollen, and then a stigma and style that's real indicative of the Onagraceae, where you have kind of this like big old dome stigma that looks like it's receptive right now because it's kind of covered in pollen, and you can see the pollen sticking to that. So the petals and sepals all fused into this tubular structure, fuchsia in color, and that can vary a little bit. The leaf color can vary as well. You're seeing that these are these particular individuals are pretty blue-gray in color, so they'd be covered with some fine hairs. And I know that they're hairs as opposed to wax because when I rub my finger on them, that blue color does not come off. But epilobium can look pretty green as well. So talking about the habit of this thing, it's a subshrub, so you'll find it in coastal scrub or sage scrub communities all the way into chaparral. And this particular species of epilobium has a real wide range, so kind of like a lot of species that occur all over California, it makes a big loop around the Central Valley. So anywhere pretty much that you find chaparral habitats, you'll at least have a chance of seeing Epilobium canum. And then right next to Epilobium is a review plant. This is one of the first plants you ever learn as a Californian. But I just wanted to point out the different color morphology here on the California poppy, where this is probably a more coastal variety here. And I believe this whole garden is supposed to be representative of island species from the Channel Islands. So there's definitely a lot of yellow to these petals here. They're not just totally orange like you would see for inland poppies. And then if you're questioning the species here, then you can see that the base of this flower here makes a real wide flange, telling you that you're definitely looking at a Schultzia californica. We're cruising around this little garden, which they've done a really nice job of bringing in plants that are representative of the flora that you might see on the Channel Islands, and this is definitely one of them. So you walk up to this plant, you don't know what it is, you've determined that it's probably not poisonous, and so the first thing I like to do, that a lot of botanists will do, is grab a leaf and sniff it. Whoa, that smells really good. Trust me. Come back to this spot when you can and give this a whiff. So, all right, the leaf smells really good. It smells sagey. I think it might be a sage. Now I'm looking at a stem and I see that there's 2 leaves at this node. Wow, that's another really good indicator that this is a sage. I can see that the leaves have little bumps on them. You might call that papillate. That's another good indicator that this is a sage. And then I look at the stems. The stems are kind of square. Sage. Oh my gosh. Now check out this inflorescence. We have to be in the genus Salvia right now. So Salvia, if we haven't told you already, means well. And so that's describing the fact that a lot of these plants in this genus are used medicinally and have been all over the world. It's a genus that occurs mostly in temperate regions all over the world. And this species right here is the purple sage. Purple sage, which is actually describing its flowers, but its scientific name describes its leaves. So Salvia leucophylla. So phyll, P-H-Y-L-L, means leaf, and leuco means white. So even though, yeah, white sage, which you may have or may not have learned by this point, is definitely a lot more white than this plant. That one is Salvia apiana, which apiana is just another way of saying white. This one is also describing the white color of its leaves. So if I rub the leaves with my finger, that white isn't really wearing off. So that tells me that these are just really fine hairs. Blue, do you agree? He's also doing a little bit of botany on his own over there, just making sure that this is indeed Salvia leucophylla. He's a real intense botanist. But back to the common name of this plant. It's called purple sage because, oh my goodness, look at that stunning inflorescence. So the genus Salvia has real typically these bunches of flowers working their way up the stem that make these little balls, and then these will be loaded with seeds. So chia is this way, black sage, white sage, all those different species. And just like all plants in the mint family, they have these 5 petals. So a real elegant lavender color here on pretty much all the flower parts. Not just the petals, but the stamens, as well as the pistil there in the middle, all have that nice lavender color to them. So you'll obviously find purple sage in any sagebrush communities, once again making a big loop around the Central Valley with its range. This is a real good one to know, Salvia leucophylla. So we got a couple new plants to learn right here, also still in the island native garden here. This is the one that caught our eye, which is just impossible not to stop and talk about. This is a genus that is really iconic of California. About half the species are native to California, and so it's a California genus of succulents. And for a lot of times when people say, "Oh, I love succulents," or "I love to grow succulents," this is what they're thinking of, or at least plants in this family. And this is the Crassulaceae family. So this is the family that CAM photosynthesis is named for. This is the first one that it was found in. So Crassulacean acid metabolism is what CAM photosynthesis stands for. And this is in the genus Dudleya. So we're only going to hold you responsible for the genus here. And this one would be pretty hard to screw up with anything else. They are super succulent plants that grow low to the ground. They make what we call a basal rosette of leaves. So really tight internodes arranged alternately. The leaves themselves are super succulent. I can pull that off and it's just loaded with water and sugar and goodness in there. Dudleyas occur, like I said, all over California, and there are plenty of Dudleyas that grow in the desert, they grow in the coast, they can grow in chaparral, all kinds of different environments. Obviously, they're very much drought adapted. In this case, we have a plant that is real gray and pretty, and if you want to know if this gray, pretty color is due to wax or hairs, you can rub it a little bit and see, oh, it comes off. Now I have that wax on my hands, and so this is clearly due to wax. And that wax falls all the way up to this inflorescence here, this nice umbel inflorescence, loaded with flowers. Dudleya all have 5 petals. So we can zoom in here on one of these flowers here. And the flowers can range in color, anywhere from yellow, pink, orange, fiery red, or everything in between, or everything all at the same time. That will eventually go to fruit and make seed, like what's happening with some of these guys that are further along back here. Dudleya, the common name for the genus, are live-forevers. They can be super hard to tell apart because all 26 or so species in California can all interbreed. So they can all hybridize, and so most of the plants that you see around are a hybrid between a couple of different things that we call, quote, species. But of course, that's just an English construct that we've made up. Okay, so then this other one is one that you've definitely seen. Whether or not you've noticed it is another thing, but this one occurs all over the northern hemisphere, actually. It's probably one of the most abundant plants on the planet. And I've seen it at 11,000 feet. I've seen it at 0 feet above sea level. And this is a plant in the Asteraceae. Call it the yarrow. It's in the genus Achillea, and this one's called Achillea millefolium. Achillea millefolium. It is named after the Greek figure Achilles, who, as we all know, was a great warrior that wasn't able to be killed until someone got to his Achilles heel. Okay, here we are standing at our last island species here. And this one's actually an island endemic, only occurs on the Channel Islands. And this is the Catalina ironwood, it's the common name, which is Lionothamnus floribundus. There's two different subspecies. Interestingly, the same species can have really different leaf morphologies, and this is one of the most common characters to distinguish between those two subspecies. So this is Lionothamnus floribundus, subspecies floribundus, and we're not going to hold you account. Did I get that wrong?
I think it's either way.
Lionothamnus floribundus, subspecies asplendifolius, whereas Lionothamnus floribundus, subspecies floribundus, actually has entire leaves, so they're not divided at all. And so I'm holding one leaf here that's been divided up into six leaflets, and it's really pretty with the shape of those kind of scale-like leaflets that are divided all the way up that stalk there. This plant is in the Rosaceae, which we've met several members from already, probably. So it's one of the few California native species that's a tree in the Rosaceae, if not the only one. This one can also be distinguished by its really beautiful bark, which is shedding and almost looks manzanita-like for some species of manzanita that have this gray shedding bark here. So a real common bundle of flowers that this would have made, some kind of white cream colored flowers, and they've since turned to fruit. So this is now an infructescence, and it's not in flower right now, but this is Lionothamnus floribundus. So our next plant, and we're just going to hold you responsible for the genus again on this one, is not native. There are no species of it that are native to California. However, it's one of the largest tree genera in the world. It's about 800 species in this genus, and that's the genus Ficus, which figs are a part of. And the figs that we think of are just one species of Ficus, the ones that we eat, and that's really the only species that's widely and regularly eaten out of the 800 or so species of Ficus. But it's a huge genus, and even though they're not native to California, they're grown in California quite a bit. And this particular species here, and then this one back there, are both different species of Ficus, but I know that they're in that genus because of a couple of really key characters. And I don't actually remember the specific epithets of either of these plants, but can be completely confident that these are in the genus Ficus because of those characters. And one kind of initial first thing you're going to do if you want to know if a plant is in the genus Ficus is rip off a leaf, and if that leaf bleeds milky sap, which this one isn't all that milky, but you can see that it's starting to bleed there, then that is a really good character. Another one is that at the apical meristem, as it's making new leaves, each leaf has a pair of stipules associated with it. So stipules, which is modified leaf tissue, and those stipules are protecting the next leaf. So I don't know how easily this one's going to give up, but under these stipules would be the next leaf for this thing, and for the sake of not totally ruining this plant, I'm going to stop there. You can see some nice milky white sap bleeding off of that. So there's 2 stipules and a leaf, 2 more stipules and a leaf, 2 more stipules and a leaf. That's another really good character for the genus Ficus. And the last one that can be a little tougher to tell, but is really common, is down at the base of the leaf, The last two major veins will make more of an acute angle than the rest of the ones. So that one's a little more esoteric, but yet it's another character for ficus. And then the last most interesting character is the flower and fruit type for ficus. So this little nugget that I'm holding right here is actually an inflorescence. And when we cut it open, we'll see whether it's actually an inflorescence or an infructescence at this point. And it's a super weird kind of inflorescence. It's one where basically branch tissue has grown out and it started to make some flowers, but that branch tissue is called invaginated around the floral tissue and made this little chamber that's loaded with flowers. This chamber where the tip of it has a really tiny little opening, and that opening is just the right size for just the right species of female wasp to fit through. So we're talking about a life cycle, a reproductive life cycle, and this is a pretty messed up one. So we'll just start at a pregnant female wasp who has been attracted to this very species of ficus by a very specific pheromone. Every single one of the 800 or so species of ficus all have their own species of wasp that will pollinate them. And they all give off their own respective pheromone compounds. So that pregnant female busts her way into this structure here, into this little inflorescence. Makes her way in there, forces her way actually, to the point where her wings break off. She's being eaten from the inside out by nematodes. It's a real brutal end of her life here. But once she gets inside, which we're looking at fruit here, but back when these were all flowers, there are a bunch of female flowers around in this zone here. And so the first thing she's going to do is go and pollinate all of those female flowers. And she's pollinating them. She's got a little sack of pollen on her side, and she can go and grab some pollen out of the sack and put it on the stigma of each one of those flowers. And then she's going to go around and drop her ovipositor down, drop, and lay her own eggs in the ovaries of each one of those flowers. So she's going to go around and drop down, drop down, drop down. And so what the figs have evolved to do is make some styles that are long and some styles that are short. So the styles that are short, her ovipositor is going to be plenty long enough to get all the way down through the style into the ovary and drop off her egg, so that that ovary will be a nice little incubator for her egg. But for the longer styles, her ovipositor won't be long enough. So her egg will get rejected, but the pollen can grow a nice long tube all the way down into that ovary and fertilize some of those ovules down in that ovary. So enough of the ovules get fertilized and this thing starts turning into an infructescence. Meanwhile, her male offspring wake up first. They're totally fertile and ready to go, and the first thing they do when they wake up is go and impregnate the females before they've even woken up. Life is harsh. The second thing they do is chew little tunnels through this kind of tight infructescence so that the females will be able to get out. Basically, all the males have big teeth and a lot of sperm. That's pretty much all they're good for. And for that reason, they die oftentimes before they even make it out of the fig. So often they die when they've never even left the fig in their entire lives. The next thing that happens is the females wake up. They're already pregnant. They know that they need to go up toward the top of this structure here and collect a bunch of pollen, which they're able to do because the males chewed up the pollen sac so that they could access the pollen. So they go, grab the pollen, load it up into their little sacs, fly out of the fig, and move on to the next one. And around it goes. So if that sounds at all interesting to you, you don't have to listen to my botched version of explaining that. On YouTube, there's a free video called The Queen of Trees, and it's a beautifully done video, all based around a species of ficus that occurs in Africa, where not just a wasp and a fig are involved, but an entire ecosystem. There's a big old toucan bird, and crocodiles, and drunk butterflies, and monkeys, and humans, and everything that relies on this one species of fig that supports basically an entire ecosystem. So the queen of trees, all you have to do is look it up on YouTube. It's a really nice video. They get footage of wasps inside figs. So a lot of you are maybe freaking out if you love figs or you love fig Newtons that you've eaten millions of wasps in your life, and that's actually probably not true. Even if you had, we're not talking about big old wasps that sting you, we're talking about really tiny little wasps. But even so, most of the figs that we eat come from figs that don't actually need to get fertilized by a female wasp for the fruit to develop. The fruit will develop on its own. That's called parthenocarpy, and it's the way that we have seedless grapes and watermelons and so on, is that ovary will start developing without even being fertilized. So fear not. Here's a species of fig here. I know for sure that this is another species of fig. So I can break off a leaf and it starts bleeding a milky white sap. This one has beautiful, elegant, heart-shaped leaves. I think it's Ficus petiolaris, but Natalie, don't get mad at me if I'm wrong. And here are even some tiny little figs developing there. And these are probably at the flower stage. So the genus Ficus is in the family, the Moraceae, by the way. And so yeah, these are all just tiny little flowers, and a female wasp has not made her way in there yet. Or maybe this species just doesn't, we don't have the right species of wasp around here to even pollinate the thing. But it is a little easier on this species to see, and I'm just going to cut off a branch. It is a little easier to see the distinction with the stipules. And maybe I can, yeah. So there's one stipule. There's another stipule. And here is the next beautiful suckling little baby leaf. So this thing has the same number of cells that one of these big mamas has. So for the rest of its life as a leaf, its cells are going to expand and do a bunch of metabolism and all that. Oh, but here we go. Here's two more stipules. And I don't think I'm anywhere near delicate enough to pull this off. Maybe I am. There's one. There's two. And there's our next baby leaf. So there might be already 8 to 10 more leaves that are already made in there and just waiting for their turn to enter into this wild, beautiful, fucked up world. Genus Ficus, Moraceae. Now you know it. Sweet. Time to learn another new family, which this one definitely does not have any species that are native to California. Pretty much all plants in this family are tropical. It's another family of monocots, and this is the Araceae. So we've learned two Aracaceae, one with an A, one with an E. This one is the Araceae, Araceae. And these are called aroids, or arums colloquially. Probably the most well-known plants in this family are calla lilies, and so the reproductive structures on this group are really the telling part. It's a really big family with over 100 genera and almost 4,000 species in this group. So super speciose. Most are from the tropics or subtropics. This particular species is called Monstera deliciosa. And I'm blanking on the common name. Devin, you have it in your head?
Swiss cheese plant.
Yeah, that's a real hard one to remember, huh? The Swiss cheese plant. I wonder why they call it that. So Monstera deliciosa, the Swiss cheese plant. So pretty huge leaves here. And if you get in, you can see that the stem tissue is all pretty much creeping along the ground. And so really what this plant would be looking for if it was in the wild is a tree. So this particular species, and this is true of a lot of aroids, that they're epiphytes. So epi, plants that grow up in the canopies of other plants, and specifically trees. So rather than making all of that really labor intensive, energy intensive material like wood to grow real tall themselves, they can just utilize the energy input of trees to get up to the top of a canopy in a real dense forest and get that limiting nutrient in those environments, which is light, or limiting resource, which is light. I guess you can't exactly call it a nutrient. So this plant is an epiphyte. These stems would grow up the tree, up the stem of a large tree somewhere in the forest. And what's really cool about a lot of aroids is they know when they're growing on a tree, and they know when they're growing along the ground. So when they're growing along the ground, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to make a monster leaf like this because, no pun intended, by the way, because there isn't any light. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to invest a bunch of energy in a big leaf like this. Instead, you should just be jamming along until you can find a tree. So they'll actually make these real tiny little reduced leaves, oftentimes ones that you can't even see, and go along, and as soon as they hit a tree, they'll start making a bigger leaf and a bigger leaf and a bigger leaf and a bigger leaf until they're making monster leaves that are doing a good amount of photosynthesis. They'll reproduce up at the top of the canopy, and then they'll droop back down, and their leaves will get smaller and smaller and smaller until they hit the ground and basically make no leaves until they find another tree. So trees can go for one of these plants can go for miles. Okay, so another kind of the main distinctive feature of plants in the Araceae is their inflorescence type here, which this is basically just a big old calla lily is what we're looking at. And when you've gotten a calla lily before, I'll just cut this off. Looks like probably Natalie has cut off another fruit from this at some other point. You think of a calla lily as having one big old petal and then this weird thing in the middle that God knows what it is, but who cares? It's pretty, right? So, but now you might be thinking, wait, one petal and what is this? Now you're thinking like a botanist, like someone who actually considers plants that they're looking at. And you might think, and you'd be right if you thought that maybe this is just a modified leaf associated with an inflorescence or a bract. And it doesn't always look like this. This one's rotting, but it would have been a really nice, beautiful, white, showy thing. And it's on the inside here where all the reproductive structures would have been. So this is now a developing fruit, but back when this was an inflorescence, this was hundreds of flowers that were all included on this stalk here. And these particular flowers were synoecious. They had both male and female parts, so they can self-pollinate, which is probably what happened with this thing. But there are plenty of other plants in their Araceae that are monoecious, and often if they're monoecious, the female flowers will be down toward the bottom and the males will be up toward the top. So if you've had the pleasure of getting to know Cameron, the greenhouse manager, or if you've been involved with any greenhouse, oftentimes they'll be growing a species in the Araceae called the Titan arum. And the Titan arum makes the largest unbranched inflorescence in the world. That's the plant that makes one huge leaf every year, and it's a leaf that can be 10, 15 feet tall. And then every maybe 10 years or so, it'll make a giant inflorescence that smells like a rotting corpse and is basically just a huge version of this thing, up to 3 or 4 feet tall. But this is Monstera deliciosa. It's an epiphyte, makes huge leaves. It's in the Araceae. It's a monocot. What else do you want to know? Go. All right, so Devin just reminded me while I was, as soon as I finished being an idiot, thinking I was funny, like, what else do you want to know? Maybe you actually want to know the technical term for these things here. So just really quickly, this modified bract, modified leaf is called a spathe. So the spathe in the Araceae can be white, can be a lot of different colors, but usually white or some kind of red. And then the inflorescence here is the spadix. So if you see a spathe and spadix, and it's a plant that looks somewhat like this with heart-shaped leaves, looks tropical, odds are it's in the Araceae. Cool. All right, so we want to know what group this plant is in. We have some idea. These look like they could be stipules covering the end. You can see this apical meristem comes to a point there. So we're thinking maybe it's a fig. Ooh, there's some other nice evidence that it's a fig. We look down at the lowest veins and see that the lowest prominent veins on the underside are at a more acute angle than everything else. So this is definitely a fig, especially when we can actually find an inflorescence over here. And if the right species of wasp was here, then we might actually be able to see one inside. This is now an infructescence. But the main reason that we wanted to come over here and show you this particular species of fig is I don't actually know what species it is. It's not a real common one. And the reason that it's able to grow here is because it stays nice and shady and protected and warm next to the building. And you know that this is definitely a tropical species because these are actually roots. These are aerial roots that are coming from an upper part of the canopy. And if it was wet and moist enough here, then the roots would plug into the ground. And you can see that that's kind of almost happening down here. This little strand almost made it down into the soil. But this is really common for ficus to make aerial roots. And in fact, there are many species of ficus that germinate in the canopies of trees. They call them strangler figs. Germinate in the canopies. They drop aerial roots down to the ground, and they end up surrounding the tree that they germinated in, and they grow with secondary growth, grow in girth, and basically choke the tree out that they germinated in. And so then there's basically a bunch of hollow trees, and then they'll move on to the next tree and the next tree. So there's a one individual banyan tree in India that actually covers many, many acres. So ficus, another real common character is these aerial roots here. If you've ever been to any kind of tropical place, then you've definitely seen ficus growing. If you've ever climbed aerial roots in Hawaii or Indonesia or whatever it may be, then odds are it was from a ficus. In fact, this individual here has some really nice characters of having aerial roots where it may have had one trunk initially and then dropped aerial roots down, so it has kind of a hollowness to the trunk as it is. If this were in the wild, then it would probably just have trunks going everywhere and be a big network of one individual with a bunch of trunks. Next plant is in the Cupressaceae, and if you are a California resident, then this is definitely one that you should know. It's our state tree. It's maybe the most iconic plant in California and maybe one of the most historically important plants in California. And this is the redwood, which the scientific name is Sequoia sempervirens. Sempervirens meaning always green. This is an evergreen tree. The leaves are, you could call them something like a blend between a needle and scale-like leaf, but they are simple leaves. So each one of these is its own leaf, alternately arranged around the stem. And it's actually these leaves that are responsible in the coast redwoods native range for allowing this thing to get water. And that's not because it takes in water from the leaves, although there's some kind of recent science that's suggesting that maybe they do actually take in water a little bit from their leaves, which is super rare for plants. But the way that they're able to get water from their leaves is because they grow on the coast where it's real foggy, north coast of California, and they can trap that fog in the leaves. The fog will condense there and then drop down to the base of the tree where the roots can actually take that water up efficiently. These are the tallest plants in the world. So in California, we have the tallest plants in the world. We have the most massive plants in the world, which is Sequoia dendron giganteum, the giant sequoia that occurs out in the southern Sierra. And then we have the oldest plants in the world, the bristlecone pines. So the range of these things is now basically Big Sur into southern Oregon, all along a strip on the coast, and you'll see that in your textbook. These trees can live for thousands of years, and one of the reasons they can do that is because they have really, really nice bark that can get up to a foot thick. So having bark that's a foot thick is basically a way of having a giant fire blanket around you. It's also a way to fight off microbes, and you can imagine if you live for 2,000 years, you've lived through a bunch of fires, floods, and everything in between. And so they're really well adapted to maintain through all of that. Can imagine what it would be like to get water from the ground up to 450 feet tall in the air. So hydrologically, they're really fascinating trees. San Francisco was built twice with this species of tree, as well as a lot of California, and it's a really devastating story and a really beautiful story actually that was really well told by a guy named Jared Farmer, who wrote a book called Trees in Paradise, where he tells California's history based on 4 different groups of trees, and this is one of the most important ones. And that's because redwood wood is really, really good lumber. It's kind of like the perfect wood for lumber. It's super light, it's super durable, it's easy to work, it totally resists rot, and for those reasons it makes really good timber. And what happened mostly in the late 1800s, throughout the 1800s actually, is they went through Northern California and just clear cut all of the most massive redwoods there. And it's estimated that out of all of the trees that they cut down, about 15% of that actually got used, between trees that splintered when they fell, or trees that got wasted for firewood, or whatever it may have been. And now all of that virgin growth redwood lumber you can only find in some old house somewhere, or maybe on an old railroad, an old building of some kind, and that wood is really sought after. When those buildings go down, people clamor for it. So one more thing here is the cones. So we're looking at a female cone here, which is pretty awesome that this tiny little cone can come from such a huge tree. But the fact that this cone is kind of more globular, and the scales of the cones don't have that umbo on them like we would see with the pine, tells us that we're in that Cupressaceae group here. So this is a full-sized female cone, and there would have been a bunch of naked seeds in there on those scales. So Devin and I were just talking a little bit, and he mentioned that he never realized that there was a redwood here, and it made me remember to tell all of you, and that's because this doesn't actually really look like a redwood. This thing looks like a poor, slowly dying, pathetic version of a redwood, whereas if we were up in Humboldt County, we would be seeing these massive things that wouldn't even have branches until you get 80 feet in the air, and they'd have full canopies and total understory of ferns underneath them, and it'd be beautiful. But for whatever reason, people like to try and grow redwoods in Southern California. They think that maybe if you irrigate them enough that they'll do fine, but they just look terrible. And every time I walk by this thing, I feel like I want to just give it a lethal injection and end its life. And they are actually going to level a few of these buildings around here and build a huge classroom building. And this redwood tree is going to be at the center of that building. So they're building a building around this thing. And I sit on the design review committee as a grad student representative. And normally I just sit there and say nothing, because it's a bunch of architects and engineers talking about what buildings they should bring in and what they shouldn't. And the one comment I ever had is, you guys are going to spend tens of millions of dollars building a beautiful building, and you're going to build it around this piece of shit. You should cut this thing down, build a bench out of it and put something that actually belongs here. But they thought they were going to listen to that, and then they decided not to. So here's a shitty Southern California redwood for you. Go see some real good ones. Cool. Okay, here we are on a real special tree. It's a special California street tree. It's really common throughout California, but it's really special evolutionarily. Actually, this is a gymnosperm, and it evolved along with some of the early gymnosperms. In fact, it's the only member of its genus that still remains. It's the only member of its family that still remains. It's the only member of its phylum that still remains. And this is a ginkgo biloba. Biloba, which describes the leaves, which can be kind of bilobed, where they have two distinct lobes like that one, and that division can be anywhere from on one side to the middle to the other side. But ginkgo biloba, and it's commonly known as a ginkgo. So it's a gymnosperm. It's in the Ginkgoaceae, in a family all of its own. And because it's so ancient, it's considered a living fossil. But it has been evolving through all that time. It is nearly extinct in the wild. There are some relic stands in China and I believe in Japan, and some people still believe that there are some populations that have yet to be discovered. But it's super common worldwide as a street tree, and there are good reasons for that. One of them being that the pests that afflict this particular tree and have co-evolved with this tree don't occur anywhere else because it's not in its native range. So it's not really susceptible to pests. It grows in a large variety of environments and soil types and all that. And as well as it just being a super beautiful, elegant tree. So it's just starting to leaf out right now. And in late fall, early winter, all the leaves will kind of synchronously turn yellow. So this whole thing will just turn into a yellow display, and many, if not all of you, have seen that before. And then those leaves will drop and it'll be totally deciduous and display the beautiful architecture of this tree. So kind of uncommon for gymnosperms to have such a delicate, broad-leafed leaf, and as well as being deciduous, dropping those leaves. But a characteristic of ginkgos is that they have this bifurcating leafination. So the leaves are actually parallel oriented, and every time there's a split in a vein, it just splits off in two. So those veins bifurcate all the way up through the course of this leaf so that they can service, that vasculature can service the entirety of the leaf there. So like pines, ginkgos also make long shoots and short shoots, and in the short shoots they'll make a bundle of leaves. So this is just some short stem tissue, and maybe at some point one of these short shoots can extend off and make a longer branch. Ginkgos are dioecious. So you have male and female reproductive parts on different flowers and on different plants. And pretty much all the ginkgos that are grown throughout the world are males, and there's good reason for that. But the male flowers don't really have, I'm sorry, I just called them flowers, didn't I? That was wrong. Ginkgos don't make flowers because they're gymnosperms. So the male cones are pretty much just all pollen, and they look like catkins essentially, but they make a ton of pollen because they're wind pollinated. So make as much pollen as you can. That's going to get blown over, hopefully, to some female. And the reason that females aren't grown horticulturally is because the female cones are actually these fleshy berry-like things, and they make in high concentration butyric acid. Butyric acid is the same compound that's responsible for making rancid butter smell the way that it does, or vomit smell the way that it does. So they smell really terrible, especially when all those cones hit the ground and start rotting. Then it's really in your face. So I'm gonna tell a story of encounter that Natalie had with a female ginkgo, which she would tell you if we were all here together, but I happen to love this story, so I'm just gonna tell it now. And so she was in the Whole Foods parking lot here in Santa Barbara, and she saw a ginkgo. There's several ginkgos in that parking lot. She saw one and said, man, I'm just kind of getting a lady vibe, like girl knows a girl, and I'm just kind of feeling like that's a female. And she walked up to the thing. Sure enough, there were some female cones on it. So if you ever want to experience a female ginkgo, then you can do that at the Whole Foods parking lot. Yeah, ginkgo biloba. There you go. Palm number 3 of the day, and now, oh yes, there's a king palm that is just in full bloom behind Evan. We'll get there, stay on track. Here we are in front of the library, and we've got several big Canary Island palms. So this is our next species, the Canary Island palm, which is Phoenix canariensis. And just like the Canary Island pine, it's also native and endemic to the Canary Islands, which are off the west coast of Morocco. But they are one of the most commonly grown palms in California and in the temperate world, and that's why we're introducing it to you. It's pretty big as far as palms go, and the trunk is pretty big. So you can imagine this thing, how stubby it would have been when it was this tall, and still it was this wide. Remember, it's not doing any secondary growth. The fronds are massive, maybe 20 feet long. And we were talking about how Washingtonia have pretty long spines along the petioles. Well, these spines are gnarly. That would go through your leg or anything, I don't know. But so we were talking about some palms are fan palms and some palms are make pinnate fronds, and this is obviously one that makes pinnate fronds. It's in the same genus as the palm that we get our dates from. So that genus Phoenix is the same genus that the date palm comes from. This is the Canary Island date palm, so people don't typically eat the fruit from this tree, but it's a close relative of the one that they do. It can hold up to 100 or so fronds in one canopy, which is really incredible. All right, let's quickly jam over to this king palm. Remember, this is Arconta Phoenix Cunninghamiana, and I was hoping to be able to show this to you earlier. The flowers aren't quite open, but this is like my favorite thing is when an inflorescence pops out. So you can see on this old inflorescence here, there's a big bract coming off of it. So each one of these inflorescences is going to emerge out of this bract. And these flowers have yet to open, but look at that purple pink color on there. Just a show off, this thing. One last palm, and that's the queen palm, and the scientific name is Sciagris romanzoffiana. This is also one of the most commonly grown palms in California and the temperate world, which is why we're showing you all of these ones. But the queen palm is one that you'll see really everywhere, and the best way to identify the queen palm is by the feather-like fronds. But one thing you may already be noticing about this frond is that most other feather palms, like the one right over there on the other side of that volleyball court, all of their leaflets are all in the same plane. So they all come off of the same central axis, and they're all in the same plane, whereas with this queen palm, all the leaflets are coming off in different planes. So it looks like a kind of more of a tuft of leaflets coming off, as opposed to them all being in the same plane. They almost kind of spiral around. They occur natively from southern Brazil all the way down to Argentina, so a pretty big range. You can see an infructescence up in that individual up there, so mid-sized berry drupes as far as palms go. So that's the last campus plant. I know Devin and I have been walking around. It feels like some zombies are gonna come out at some point. This place is a ghost town, and maybe you would have never thought that you would miss being on campus so much. I know that's one thing that I've thought recently, and it's made me think a little bit more about the fact that, you know, there's that cliche that you don't really know what you have until it's gone, and you don't know what you're going to miss until it's gone. And I don't want to throw that direct cliche at you, but rather something really nice to consider, I think, and that's that no matter what situation you're in, even if it's one that seems really shitty, like the one that we're in right now, there's going to be something to miss about the situation that we're in right now. And so I think it's a good exercise to try and find that and to focus on that, and find the things that are going on in your life right now, even if things are in total disarray, things that maybe are a little nicer or a little easier, and reflect on those, because it's not always going to be this way. And one day we'll be back to some normal, maybe it's a new normal, but there will be something that you miss about that. So try and hold on to that while it's here. I'll say again that as of now, at least, there are still places to get out and go and be in nature. And now we've taught you a lot of plants that occur not even in nature, just in horticultural landscapes. So go out and try and find those for yourself, get a personal relationship with them. Hopefully we all get to meet in person at some point, but for now, be well wherever you are. We're on our way over to the Douglas Preserve to show you some blue gum eucalyptus, and we're driving along through the Mesa Lane neighborhood and came upon this tree behind me. Does anyone know what species this tree is? There's actually two of them. If you guessed redwood, unfortunately you are correct. If you're from Northern California, that looks nothing like a redwood, right? And I just wanted to stop again and show you an example of what happens when you take something that is adapted to some other place and you try and force it to grow in Southern California, where there's way too much direct sunlight, not nearly enough fog, not nearly enough rain, and it just looks like an absolute dog, unfortunately. And so it's terrible to see one of California's most iconic trees, if not the most iconic California tree, turning into something that I just wish I could give a nice, slow, peaceful death. And I was just thinking maybe one day when I'm an even crazier old man, I can have a little needle and syringe and that I can take with me to give nice little lethal injections to every Southern California redwood I see, and they can die peaceful deaths, and we can just build some nice furniture from them or something like that. All right, on to Douglas. All right, here we are at the Douglas Preserve, and you're looking out at Santa Cruz Island there. You can't see Santa Rosa Island, which would be behind it, and that's where the Torrey pine occurs natively, which we talked about a little bit earlier. But now we're at the Douglas Preserve, which overlooks Mesa Lane Beach down to the east, and then west is Hendry's Beach or Royal Borough, so maybe you've seen that before. But here we are at the Douglas Preserve, and we're here because we're going to learn our last species for the quarter, which I think is an awesome one to end off with, and that's the blue gum eucalyptus, or the Tasmanian blue gum. And there is a pretty old grove of them here that you can walk through. As happens with blue gums in California, especially the way that they planted them, there's a lot of die-off, and so this grove would be way thinner now than it was before. Also, not just from die-off, but also because a large contingent of California humans have a deep, deep-seated hatred for them, which we'll talk about. But first, we should just take a look at a couple of these trees. So Dana's panning around to this individual that we're going to talk about right here, and there's some bigger ones throughout, and you can see kind of in the distance that there's some big blue gums back there. So the common name for it is the Tasmanian blue gum, because it's native to the island of Tasmania, which is part of Australia if you don't know, and it's off the southeast corner of Australia, so pretty much just south of Melbourne. And so it's the Tasmanian blue gum, It's in the genus Eucalyptus, which is in the Myrtaceae, and we haven't talked about any plants from the Myrtaceae because they're old world plants. Australia is probably about the center of diversity for Myrtaceae, but also Southeast Asia and South Africa. But yeah, it's a huge family, and Eucalyptus is a huge genus. It is a genus of all trees or kind of shrubby tree-like things. And there's 700 to 800 species of eucalypts, depending on who you ask. And eucalyptus has a couple of sister genera. There's Corymbia and Angophora that are also, especially Corymbia, widely grown around town. The lemon-scented gum is in the genus Corymbia, but eucalyptus is a massive genus, 700 or 800 species. But when people think of eucalyptus, they think of this species right here, the Tasmanian blue gum, which is Eucalyptus globulus. Eucalyptus globulus, and we'll talk a little bit more about how it gets its name. But I think before we get into the botanical esoterics and talk about things like phyllotaxy, which is normally boring, but maybe not so boring for this species, we should get a little bit of a history lesson about it. And this is one of California's most iconic, important trees, actually. And there's a guy named Jared Farmer who wrote a beautiful book called Trees in Paradise, where he pretty much told a pretty complete history of California in the context of 4 different groups of trees, and eucalyptus was one of those. And he wrote about the entire history of it, from its introduction in the mid-late 1800s to where they are now. And it's a fascinating history, and it's led us in this place where some people love them and some people hate them. And either way, it's worth knowing, if you're a Californian or live in California, a little bit about that history. And so what most people believe, which is true, is that they were brought to California as a potential source of lumber. As we may have talked about to this point, in early California history, they encountered, especially up in Northern California, redwoods and Douglas fir, which they pretty much immediately wiped out. And they built San Francisco twice with redwoods, and all the Douglas fir had been cut down. And so at that point, they're like, oh shit, we're gonna be out of timber. And you gotta remember that this is the mid 1800s or late 1800s, when things are not made out of metal, things are not made out of plastic or concrete. The streets that you walk on could be made out of wood and redwood. And California was just whipping through wood at an unprecedented rate, and realized that they were going to run out. And so people started looking around for good substitutes for things that maybe made good lumber, grew fast, and so on. But before that wave hit in kind of the early 1900s, eucalyptus were brought into California as kind of a horticultural specimen. You can imagine what it would be like if you were from the East Coast, which is really beautifully densely wooded with deciduous forests and almost kind of temperate rainforests, and then you come to the West Coast and it's beautiful here. The weather's perfect, the soils are fertile, everything grows, except to them it was kind of ugly because there were no trees. It's just a bunch of chaparral and coastal scrub, right? It's kind of rare that you get into like an oak woodland or something like that. And so there was belief in the mid 1800s that you could not only beautify a landscape, but you could also influence the weather by having more trees. They thought if you had more trees, then it would rain more. And so eucalyptus was one of the groups of trees that was brought into California to accomplish that. And one of the largest importers and growers of eucalyptus in California was a guy named Elwood Cooper. And that name Elwood might ring a bell if you've ever been to the Elwood Grove or Elwood Bluffs just west of campus. That's who it's named after. And that's why there's all those blue gums there. And not just blue gums, but a bunch of different species of eucalyptus. And Elwood Cooper was one of the first to bring them in and kind of use them not only for horticulture and not only to change the weather, but also as a windbreak, right? They were, California, there was a boom in agriculture, And especially on the coast, you get a lot of northwest winds. And so these blue gums that grow really fast and create a nice wall make a nice windbreak for whatever it is that you're trying to grow and protect. In addition to that, blue gums were kind of thought of, or eucalyptus in general was thought of to be a cure-all. So it would be like in the early 2000s, maybe acai, or now maybe CBD, or something like that. And back then they thought it would treat everything from cancer to herpes to you name it. And so it was thought of as kind of an elixir. And then it was in the 1900s that they're like, oh shit, we're gonna run out of timber. Here is something, Blue is making a new lizard friend. Here's something that grows super fast, and in Tasmania makes awesome wood. They use it for lumber all the time in Australia, and can grow in some kind of shitty, sandy, infertile soils. And so let's bring it over here and see if we can prevent this famine. So what they did is they convinced a bunch of landowners in California to basically wipe out all that ugly coastal scrub and chaparral, clear cut it, and let's plant eucalyptus trees, basically like rows of corn. And there are old, maybe I'll put in an image from this, there are old advertisement images of literally the Jolly Green Giant planting rows of eucalyptus because it's going to be the cure to this timber famine. Elwood Cooper bought his land for $2 an acre. $2 an acre in the mid-1800s. So you can imagine people who were landowners in California had a lot of land. And so if you're trying to figure out what to do with all this land, and there's gonna be a huge demand for timber, then there were some big time parties that came through and convinced people to plant blue gums on their property. And that's why we're left with all of these relic stands of eucalyptus all over coastal California, everywhere from Sonoma all the way down to San Diego. Turns out when you plant them that close to one another in super sandy soil, and then they all grow up super quick and spindly, they are shading each other out, and you're trying to harvest them within 20 or 30 years, and by that point they're just these kind of spinny sticks. You chop them down and try and mill them into lumber, and the wood splits and twists, and it's completely useless for not just for growing timber, but even for just trying to make it into like railroad ties. It was no good for that either. So now we're left with all of these pretty much useless stands of blue gum. Useless until the monarch butterflies found them and set up nests in them, and now we know that they're super important for monarch butterfly migration every year. So on one hand, you have people who hate blue gums, not only because they are not native and not from here, but to add to the story, there's also a belief that the leaves and the bark and all the vegetative tissue from blue gums actually has allelopathic chemicals. And allelopathy is the chemical inhibition of one plant's growth on another. And so they actually believe that that nothing grows under eucalyptus because there's an actual chemical inhibition. Turns out that's not actually true, according to research that was done in the last couple of years at Cal Poly. Most of the research that was done that showed allelopathy exists was done in the 60s, and there was some pretty shoddy science, pretty shoddy controls, and so their data wasn't all that believable. But some work has shown that it's not actually a chemical inhibition, but more likely a physical inhibition. When you plant things right next to each other in rows, and they make a bunch of shade, and not only do they make a bunch of shade, but they drop all their leaves. They're constantly dropping their bark, their flowers, all kinds of stuff, to the point where if anything even wanted to germinate under it, well, there's no light for it to get, and so the only things that you see growing under eucalyptus groves are like poison oak, essentially, or other things that can be really hardy and handle those kinds of conditions. So there's a plug for Jared Farmer's book, Trees in Paradise. If you're interested at all, it's definitely worth a read. He goes through redwoods and citrus and palms as well. But the story behind eucalyptus is really a fascinating one. Okay, so here we are looking at an actual individual, and of course starting with the leaves is a great place to start with flowering plants. And with any kind of plant, I guess. And so let's walk around the canopy here. And the reason I want to walk over here is because the juvenile leaves of blue gums are kind of interesting. Because, and this is true of actually of a lot of eucalypts, the juvenile leaves are different from the adult leaves. And so this is kind of a cool branch because it has both juvenile and adult leaves on it. So when it's making juvenile leaves, you can see that they're definitely waxier, and they get a lot waxier than this. They're wider, and they're arranged opposite to one another. So there's 2 leaves at every node. So we can see that there's 2 leaves at every node here, and there's a couple nice waxy leaves. And then once we get up toward the end of this stem, it's starting to make some more adult-like leaves. And these leaves are kind of oblanceolate, maybe you would say, and just more linear in general. And they get to be kind of sickle-shaped. A sickle is the tool that the Grim Reaper uses, and that's kind of how they can be described. So not only does the shape change, but now they're arranged alternately. So 1 leaf at every node. If you were here, you could smell it and see why it would be used for medicinal things. And some of you probably have eucalyptus essential oils or extracts or use them for this or that. And it's not to say that they're not useful for that kind of thing. They very well can be, but rarely is something that is advertised to be a cure-all elixir actually is. So they've got really cool bark, eucalypts in general. And some of them will have kind of a more deeply furrowed, older bark, kind of like an oak or something, or a pine. But a lot of eucalypts have really thin bark that sheds in these thin strips, and they're constantly shedding it. And more so at some parts of the year than others. And you can see up in the higher part of the canopy that there's thinner strips of bark that came from thinner parts of the tree. This is not something that you would want to do to a tree that you really cared about or liked. But for blue gums, it's fine because all of this bark is no longer conducting sugar. It's no longer conducting, has any phloem attached to it. The phloem would be on the inside of this newer layer of bark. So if I pulled off this newer layer of bark and even deeper than that in there, then I would be pulling off that thin layer of phloem, and that would be a good way to girdle the tree and not a nice thing to do. So they have shedding bark like this, and you can see evidence of that all over the ground. So the name eucalyptus comes from 2 Greek words put together, EU, which means well, and kalyptos, which means covered. So well covered is referring to the flowers. Oh, here's a nice cap. Sweet. And so what they mean by that is this is a flower. This is a kind of an aborted fruit, I guess, but it was once a flower. And it consists of a floral base here, which would have had its petals and sepals have been modified into this woody tissue down here, and these flowers are all stamens, and that's really typical of plants in the Myrtaceae, that the showy part of the flower is actually the stamens as opposed to the petals or sepals. So this particular species would have some cream colored, yellow, really pretty stamens, and a lot of them, as well as a pistil in there. And once pollination goes through, then it will turn into this fruit type, which is a chambered capsule, essentially. And this is one way to identify eucalyptus by how many valves they have, they call them here. So blue gums have 4 valves. And another interesting thing about blue gum flowers is that they're born singly, as opposed to being born in a cluster of flowers or an inflorescence. Blue gum is one of the only species of eucalyptus to do that. So back to the well-covered thing, back when this thing was smaller and was just a flower, it's now expanded into a fruit. But when it was smaller and a flower, then it would have had a little cap like this on it. And this cap is protecting those stamens as they're developing. And once they get fully developed, then the cap will come and fall off. And you can see that on eucalypts that are about to flower, where the cap is just nearly off and you can pull it off. It's a pretty satisfying thing to do. So eucalyptos, well covered, and globulus means little button. And that's describing this fruit type here, which looks like a little button. So, a lot of people in California are going to tell you to hate eucalyptus for all kinds of reasons. They might mention also that they're super flammable and that they were responsible for the Berkeley fires in the 80s. So they're just like anything, there are two sides to every coin, right? In this case, there are way more than two sides to this story. So it's good to be totally informed on this so that you can make an opinion for yourself. And maybe your opinion's like mine, like you're agnostic and can just appreciate them as a really wonderful, important part of California's history. It's something not to be ignored or hated, but just to kind of be aware of. These things do reproduce on their own, which is a bummer. And so this particular species is actually one of the only weedy eucalypts in California that reproduces on its own. So it is one that people try to get rid of when they can. Let's have this nice backdrop for the final. I gave you in the North Campus open space field trip a little farewell, but this is actually truly officially the end of the quarter right here. And I just want to say again, for all of you as a whole, I've been TAing botany classes for the last 5 years and looking at field notebooks for all those 5 years, and I have never seen a better aggregation of field notebooks. And that happened to be during one of the weirdest, most backwards times in any of our lives. And so I just want to say how impressed I am and proud I am that you took this as an opportunity to do something in a different way and not complain, but get creative and make something really beautiful that you can be proud of for the rest of your lives. And for those of you who made digital field notebooks, I really hope you find a way to print them, because as you know, digital stuff goes away, believe it or not, and that printed material is something that you're going to pull out in 10, 15 years, and it'll maybe even shed a tear for some of you if you're sappy like me. So for those of you who are graduating, congratulations. For those of you who are still at UCSB, I hope we get to meet in person at some point. I hope you have a wonderful summer, and thank you again.